Now we'll be starting with Chapter 9, and Chapter 9 is joints. This first PowerPoint will take us through the different classification of types of joints. So the purpose of this chapter is going to be to introduce the various types of joints in our body. We also want to discuss how we classify our joints, and then we'll learn the types of movements that can be carried out at a joint. So, what is a joint exactly? A joint can also be called an articulation or an arthrosis. This arthrosis term you'll be hearing very frequently as we go through and classify our types of joints later. So just remember that a joint is any articulation or an arthrosis because it is a point of contact between either two or more bones, between cartilage and bone, or a point of contact between teeth and bone. So the commonality here is that it's always a point of contact between bone and then something else. When we study joints scientifically, it is called arthrology. And then when we study the motion we can create, it's called kinesiology. Classifying our joints can be done structurally or functionally. When we classify the joints structurally, it's going to be based on the presence or the absence of a synovial or joint cavity, and it's also going to be based on the type of connecting tissue or connective tissue involved. So we'll ask two questions to classify a joint structurally. Is there a joint cavity? And what type of connective tissue is involved? We'll talk about the structural classifications of joints later, but it can be either fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. And then functionally, we want to ask what degree of movement does this joint permit? So the types we have there are synarthroses, meaning immovable, amphiarthroses, partially movable, or a diarthroses, freely movable. So as I mentioned, here are the structural classifications of joints that we have. Fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, synovial joints, and then I've also listed the types of fibrous and cartilaginous joints there. And we'll go through these in more detail, but this is just so that you can see kind of an outline. And here are the functional classifications of the joints. So, starting with our fibrous joints. Excuse me. Fibrous joints will lack a synovial cavity. There is no joint cavity present with fibrous joints. They'll have dense fibrous connective tissue that will hold the two articulating bones together, and they will permit little or no movement. So we said that little or no movement would make them a synarthroses or an amphiarthroses when we talk about their functional classification. But right now we're talking about the structural classification. So no synovial cavity present and dense fibrous connective tissue connecting the two articulations of the bones. We have sutures, syndesmosomes, and then our interosseous membranes that make up our fibrous joints. A suture is going to be a fibrous joint that has a thin layer of dense fibrous connective tissue uniting the bones of the skull. And then under there I have the syntosis because that's what we call a suture joint that has ossified completely. So an example here would be the frontal suture that's between the left and the right sides of our frontal bones. And so this syntosis is functionally classified as a synarthrosis because since it has ossified, there is no movement at that joint. Next, we have our syndesmosomes, and this is going to be a fibrous joint in which there is more fibrous connective tissue than we had in our suture. Here we have two examples of that, and the first example is what we call a gymphosis. It's going to be a fibrous syndesmosome joint in which we have a cone-shaped peg that fits into a socket and does not allow movement. So this cone-shaped peg fits into the socket, allowing no movement. So it would be a synarthroses if we classify it functionally. An example of this gymphosis is the root of a tooth in its socket. So we know that, normally speaking, our teeth do not move in the socket. So therefore, it's a syndesmosis or gymphosis. Another example of our syndesmosomes are the distal tibiofibular ligament. And so this actually permits some movement, and so therefore we would classify this as an amphiarthrosis. And then our last type of fibrous joint is our interosseous ligament, or you can also call them the interosseous membranes. And these are fibrous joints made of a broad sheet of ligament that allows some movement between the adjacent bones. So in this case, it would be amphiarthrosis if we classify it functionally. An example here would be between the radius and the ulna for an interosseous membrane. And here we just have examples of each. So we're showing the suture here in the skull bones. And then here we're seeing how there can be a little slight movement at the suture joint. And then we're showing our syndesmosomes that we talked about. So the root of the tooth here into the socket or the gymphosis. And then the fibula and the tibula with the ligament in between as a syndesmosis. And then finally, this interosseous membrane. So we gave the example between the radia and the ulna here. Alright, and then this is just a table summarizing everything that we just discussed and talked about. These tables can also be found in your textbook, whether that's online or the paper version. Our cartilaginous joints. So this is the second type of joint here. The cartilaginous joint will also lack a synovial cavity. It has cartilage that's going to articulate the bones, and this is either going to be fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage. So we'll have fibrocartilage or hyaline cartilage articulating our bones, and it will permit little or no movement. So once again, these will either be synarthroses or amphiarthroses type of joints. And we have three types of cartilaginous joints: the synchondroses, the symphysis, and then we have one that we group into this classification, but it's just a little different. So the synchondroses would be a cartilaginous joints in which the connecting material here is going to be hyaline cartilage, and this will not allow any movement. So we have our synarthroses as far as the functional classification goes. Next is our symphysis, and these are cartilaginous joints in which the connecting material is going to be a disc of fibrocartilage, and there's a little movement allowed. So we have the amphiarthroses for functional classification. And some examples here would be your intervertebral disc and the pubic symphysis. And finally, we have our epiphyseal cartilage. So this is where we talked about with the bones when we have that epiphyseal plate still occurring. And that epiphyseal cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage, and it's located within the growth centers during our bone formation, or during that endochondral bone formation. So I have a star by that because we know that that won't always be present, because once we close that epiphyseal plate, that cartilage is no longer present. So here we're showing you our synchondroses here at the manubrium and your first rib. That articulation there, it's hyaline cartilage, allows no movement, so synarthroses functionally. And then the pubic symphysis, allowing a little movement here, and that will be our symphysis joints. And then finally, these growth plates here are the epiphyseal plates for the epiphyseal cartilage. Alright, so there's the table summarizing everything. And then our last type of joint that we have in our body is going to be a synovial joint. These synovial joints will have a synovial cavity. So we said when we are classifying our joints structurally, the first thing we asked was, is there a synovial cavity or joint cavity or not? So synovial joints are in fact the only of the three types of joints that have a synovial cavity, and hence how they're named. We'll also have, so this synovial or this joint cavity is going to be between the articulating bones, and these joints will be freely movable or permit a large range of movement. By permitting a large range of movement, that means we classify them functionally as diarthritic or diarthroses. And then there's also going to be an articular capsule present. So the articular cartilage here will cover the bone at the synovial joints, and this articular cartilage serves to reduce friction at the joint with the movement, and it also helps to absorb the shock. And then finally, the articular capsule, it's going to surround the diarthrosis and enclose the synovial cavity to unite the articulating bone. So here you can see this entire articular capsule here, and so it is surrounding the entire diarthrosis or the joint, enclosing the synovial cavity that we have, and it unites the two bones together. The articular capsule will be composed of two layers. It has an outer fibrous membrane as well as its inner synovial membrane. So the outer capsule here in the gray and the inner membrane in the red. And this outer fibrous capsule oftentimes contains ligaments, and the inner synovial membrane will be able to secrete a lubricating fluid that we call synovial fluid. It also nourishes the joint. The flexibility of our fibrous capsule will permit the movement that we get at this joint, and its great tensile strength will help to prevent bones from dislocating. We have other features of the capsule that include ligaments and the articular fat pads. So our synovial fluid that was secreted by this membrane here, it lubricates the joint, it helps to reduce friction in the joint, and it supplies nutrients to and removes metabolic waste for the joint. So it serves three purposes: to lubricate and reduce friction, and then to supply nutrients and remove the metabolic waste from the joints. So two main things, because the lubrication will help to reduce the friction. So lubricate and reduce friction, and then to supply nutrients and remove waste. And then finally, our synovial joints will have accessory ligaments and articular disc, or can have accessory ligaments and articular disc. And so a ligament will help hold bone to bone. And oftentimes we'll find these ligaments and articular discs in our diarthroses, or those freely movable joints. Our articular disc are what we call menisci. So when you think about your knee, you think about the meniscus of your knee. That is an articular disc. The articular disc will work to modify the shape of the joint surface and the articulating bone. It'll help to maintain the stability of the joint, and it can also direct the flow of synovial fluid to areas of the greatest friction. We also can have a labrum, which is an important structure for the ball and socket type of joints. We'll talk about ball and socket type of joints in the next section. And then finally, a clinical connection to bring things back around, torn cartilage. So torn cartilage will occur frequently in the knees of athletes, and this torn cartilage is damage to our articular disc that are between the ends of some of the bones. So here it would be between the ends of your femur and your tibia, and so we will remove this torn cartilage oftentimes to prevent the erosion and to prevent arthritis in that joint. And so generally to remove this torn cartilage, we go in with a procedure that we call arthroscopy. And so that arthroscopy goes into the actual joint and removes the torn cartilage. And then note that your joint cavities will have nerves that supply them, and they're going to be the same nerves that supply the skeletal muscles that actually move the joint in that area. And you'll also have numerous arteries and veins supplying the joints and the surrounding structures. And then the last type of part that we'll talk about with our just joints in general here are going to be the bursa and the tendon sheaths. Now these bursae and tendon sheaths, these are going to be part of our synovial joints if present. And the bursa are synovial-filled fluid sac-like structures. These fluid-filled sac-like structures of synovial fluid will cushion the movement of one body part over the other. So they serve as kind of a little fluid pillow, so to speak. And they're found where one body part moves over the other. And then we have tendon sheaths. The tendon sheaths will be a tube-like bursa that wraps around the tendons where there is considerable amounts of friction. So, for example, the tendon of the biceps brachii at our shoulder joint. And so this is a tendon-like sheath or a tube-like bursa that wraps around the tendons. And so it gives it that protection or that cushion. And so if either of these two, the bursa or the tendon sheaths, become inflamed, we can have a condition known as bursitis, which is the chronic inflammation of that bursa, or we can have tenosynovitis. So we'll pause here. Now that you have the classification of each type of joint, you should be able to note the differences in each joint as well as give examples of them. And you want to be able to structurally and functionally classify your